Welcome back to English from A to Z, English in real life. Today, we are diving into one of the biggest, most frustrating hurdles for, well, pretty much anyone learning English, pronunciation. We're going to talk about why, no matter how much you practice, you just can't seem to sound the way you want to. And we're about to uncover the real reason. And I'm telling you, it's probably not what you think. I mean, does this sound familiar? You've spent hours repeating sounds, right? You watch all the tutorials, you're practicing in front of the mirror, but then when you actually go to speak, it still just doesn't sound right. If you've ever felt that kind of frustration, like you're just stuck on a pronunciation plateau and not getting any better, you are definitely not alone. So, what's really going on with this whole pronunciation puzzle? Most of us think we know the answer, and, it usually points to one really obvious culprit. And yeah, it seems totally logical. When we hear a sound that just doesn't exist in our own language, our brain's default setting is to just swap it out for the closest sound it does know. This isn't a mistake you're choosing to make. It's this automatic, behind-the-scenes substitution that's really at the root of most of our pronunciation struggles. So the logical solution that everyone tells you is to just isolate those problem sounds. You know the ones, the short I, the R, and just drill them again and again and again. Practice them over and over until your mouth finally gets it right. I mean, it makes sense on the surface, but there is a massive flaw in this approach that keeps so many of us completely stuck. And that's because the real problem, it isn't actually your mouth. It's your brain. Okay, this is the absolute core of the issue. See, a baby's brain is like a sponge, just soaking up every new sound it hears. But as adults, our brains have already built these, fixed sound categories based on our native language. This makes it super difficult to even notice the subtle differences in new sounds. So the real challenge isn't making the sound, it's hearing the sound in the first place. It's a problem of perception. Okay, let's take a look at a classic example. Your ears might physically hear two different words, like the long E in cheap and the short I in chip. But your brain, acting like a filter based on your native language, can totally override that and just perceive both sounds as the same. So what you end up hearing is cheap and cheap. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. This is a real experience for so many people. As one learner put it, they knew the words were different on paper, but to their ears, they sounded exactly the same. So this wasn't a failure of practice. It was a failure of perception. And this brings us to the most important question, right? It's the absolute core of the pronunciation puzzle. If you can't even hear the difference between two sounds, how on earth are you ever going to make the difference with your mouth? It's impossible. You'll just keep thinking you're saying it right, even when you're not. Okay, but here's the good news. Fortunately, there is a way to get past this, and it's all based on some really fascinating research. The key isn't to just practice more, but to practice smarter by training your brain first. In this method is called contrastive listening. Now, the main goal here isn't to get your speaking perfect right away. No, the primary goal is to train your brain to finally notice those tiny, subtle differences in sound that it's been ignoring all this time. The method itself is actually really simple. Here's how it works in 4 steps. Step 1, you listen to one word, let's say cheap. Step 2, immediately after, you listen to its contrasting partner, chip. Step 3 is the most important. You just notice the difference. You just repeat this back-to-back listening, really focusing on that subtle change. And then step 4, only after your brain starts to consistently hear that difference do you actually start practicing the sounds yourself. So why is this simple back and forth thing so much more effective than just drilling one sound over and over? Well, it comes down to a few key principles that are really powerful. Okay, there are 3 main reasons this method works so well. First, it builds awareness. It basically forces your brain to admit, okay, these sounds are actually different. Second, a lot of these exercises use exaggeration, which makes the differences so much clearer and almost impossible to ignore. And third, that direct comparison, it short circuits your brain's bad habit of just swapping out the new sound for an old one. And that's really the science behind it all. When you hear those two words, one right after the other, you're giving your brain the direct comparison it needs to finally create a new category for that sound. So instead of just hearing sound A and sound A again, it finally starts to hear sound A and sound B. All right, so this all sounds great in theory, right? The concept is solid, but the big question, the one we all want to know, is does this actually work in the real world? Does it get results? And that's a totally fair question. Can a simple listening trick really fix pronunciation problems that you might have been struggling with for years? Well, the answer is a huge, resounding yes. In fact, the speaker from our source material didn't just read about this method, they used this exact technique to totally transform their own pronunciation. They went from being confusing to being crystal clear. And here's the proof right here. You can see the before and after. Before, word pairs like cheap and chip, or leave and live, were pronounced exactly the same. You can just imagine how many confusing conversations that caused. But after using contrastive listening, they were finally able to hear the difference and, more importantly, make the difference. And we're not talking about a small improvement here. This one method allowed them to fix more than 90% of their pronunciation mistakes. That led to a massive increase, not just in how clear they sounded, but in how confident they felt when speaking English. So this really leaves us with a final big question to think about. To master speaking, must you first master listening? We always think of them as separate skills, but maybe they're way more connected than we realize. Maybe the true path to speaking clearly actually begins with learning how to truly listen.